On a quiet Tuesday morning in 1989, a family vanished from their farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania without a single trace. No broken windows, no faucet doors, no blood, no note to use a kit on tables for breakfast, plates left untouched, and children's toys scattered across the living room floor. Their dog lay still at the foot of the stairs, waiting. A neighbor stepped inside expecting greetings, but found only silence and a house that looked paused in time. Within an hour, the sheriff arrived, searching every home, every window, every enough land outside. But there were no footprints, no trail, and no explanation, only a home left behind like they never walked out.
In the quiet hills of rural Pennsylvania, the Walker family lived a life marked by simplicity and serenity. Their farmhouse, nestled far from a nearest neighbor, was a reflection of their peaceful existence, tucked beneath the embrace of tall trees and the distant hum of nature. In 1989, the Walkers, consisting of Daniel, a soft-spoken farmer in his mid-30s, Emma, his nurturing wife, and their two young children, Sarah, 7, and Noah, 5, were known to their few acquaintances as an unassuming family. To outsiders, they might have appeared to be another face of rural America, their lives blending seamlessly with the landscape they inhabited. But one autumn morning, everything changed. It was September 12, 1989, a Tuesday, and when a neighbor, Mrs. Clara Wells, stopped by the farmhouse to deliver a loaf of freshly baked bread, she was met with an eerie silence. She called out for Emma, as she always did when delivering goods to her friends, but there was no answer, no sign of the Walkers. The house seemed abandoned, but there was nothing visibly amiss, no signs of a struggle, no broken windows. In fact, nothing about the home suggested that anything out of the ordinary had occurred, except that the family was gone. The kitchen table was set, but the plates, untouched, had begun to cool. The smell of yesterday's dinner still lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of fresh bread as it passed into the house. The front door was unlocked, hanging loosely on its hinges, yet nothing had been disturbed. There were no footprints in the dirt, no indication of a hasty departure. The children's toys, strewn across the living room floor, sat undisturbed. Emma's apron hung on a hook near the door, as if she had just stepped away. Sarah's favorite book was open on the couch, its pages fluttering slightly from a breeze that wafted through the cracked windows. The family dog, a loyal border collie named Jasper, lay at the foot of the stairs, as though waiting for their return. It was as though they had simply vanished, as if life inside the farmhouse had frozen in time. Clara grew uneasy as she ventured further inside, calling for the family again. When there was no response, she stepped outside and flagged down a passing truck. Her hands were shaking, and she could barely manage to explain the strange sight she had come across. The truck driver, a local named Gerald Thompson, walked inside with her, but quickly saw what she had already observed. The Walkers were gone. The sense of abandonment settled in like a fog. There was no indication of any foul play, but the emptiness was unsettling. They immediately contacted the local sheriff's department. Sheriff Jack Holden, a man of middle age and quiet resolve, arrived within the hour. He knew the Walkers well. Daniel, a soft-spoken man, had worked tirelessly on his farm, raising crops and caring for the land. Emma, his wife, was known in town for her kindness and nurturing demeanor. She had always been willing to lend a hand, helping in the church and assisting other local farmers with whatever they could. Their children, Sarah and Noah, were the picture of innocence, often seen playing in the fields or helping their mother with the gardening. It was hard to imagine any reason why they would leave, especially without a word to anyone. Holden stepped inside, inspecting the scene carefully. The air in the house felt still, almost suffocating. He checked the doors, the windows, even the basement. The doors hadn't been forced open, and there were no signs of a struggle. The few personal items left behind, jackets, shoes, and a stack of mail, suggested a hurried departure, but they were not the kind of items one would expect to leave behind in a panic. It was a mystery with no clear answer. By the time the police arrived, word had already spread through the small town. Families gathered at the diner, speculating on what could have happened to the Walkers. Some whispered about the possibility of a sudden, desperate decision to leave their life behind. Others suggested something far darker. But the truth was, no one really knew anything. In the absence of evidence, people began to fill the silence with their own theories, each one more fantastical than the last. The investigation began almost immediately, with Sheriff Holden leading the charge. He contacted the state police and even the FBI, but no one could find any leads, any trace of the walkers. A search party combed the surrounding woods for miles, looking for any sign that they had wandered off. Local dogs were brought in to track their scent, but nothing turned up. No footprints, no scents leading away from the farmhouse, nothing. It was as if the walkers had vanished into thin air. For days, the investigation dragged on with no significant breakthroughs. As the hours turned into days and then weeks, a sense of dread settled over the town. The walkers, a family who had been part of the local fabric for years, had disappeared without a trace. The few close friends and relatives of the walkers were stunned, unable to fathom any explanation. They had never expressed an intention to leave, never mentioned any problems that would have caused them to suddenly vanish. Emma had been planning Sarah's birthday party that very week, and Daniel had made plans to harvest the crops in just a few days. Everything seemed normal. As the weeks wore on, rumors began to swirl. Some believed the family had simply disappeared, choosing to start a new life away from their old one, but this seemed out of character for the walkers. Others speculated that they had been abducted, taken against their will by someone who knew them well. The absence of any ransom note or communication made this theory harder to believe, yet the possibility remained. The most chilling theory, however, was that the family had been taken by a stranger, someone who knew the area well and had been watching them for weeks, perhaps even longer. The mystery deepened when the authorities found no sign of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been in the house aside from the family. It became clear that if this was a kidnapping, the kidnapper had been extraordinarily careful. But there were no known suspects, no leads, no sightings of suspicious vehicles in the area. It was as though the family had simply evaporated. Sheriff Holden couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that gnawed at him as the investigation stretched on. There had to be something, some clue, something that would give him a break. But no such thing ever materialized. As the days passed, the case grew colder, and the town was left to dwell in the unknown, haunted by the silence that had replaced the lives of the walkers. Then, just when it seemed like the case might fade into the back of everyone's mind, a new lead came in. It was small, almost insignificant in comparison to the scale of the mystery, but it was something. A local man, known for his occasional visits to the Walker farm to assist with odd jobs, claimed to have seen something unusual on the morning of the disappearance. But what he had seen and what it meant, no one yet knew. It would take months before the authorities realized that this new lead would open a door to an even darker truth, a truth that would haunt everyone involved for years to come. And so the mystery of the walkers' disappearance lingered unanswered, casting a shadow over the quiet town as they waited for the truth to reveal itself, if it ever would. The discovery of the Walker family's disappearance sent ripples through the small, quiet town, a place where everyone knew each other by name. As the sheriff, Jack Holden, stood in the empty farmhouse, his mind raced, tried to make sense of what had happened. The silence that hung in the air was suffocating, thick with questions that no one seemed able to answer. No signs of violence, no ransom note, no witnesses. It felt as though the family had simply vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind nothing but the remnants of their everyday lives. Yet something about the scene didn't sit right with Holden. The house was too calm, too untouched. The absence was almost palpable, and it gnawed at him. He immediately called in local law enforcement, asking them to begin canvassing the area. The sheriff's department mobilized a search, scouring the woods that surrounded the Walker property, moving through the tall grass and thickets, hoping to find some clue, some trace of the family that had simply disappeared. It wasn't long before word spread through town. Families stopped what they were doing, gathered in hushed conversations at the local diner, in the post office, in the parking lot of the grocery store. The Walkers had been part of the community for years, and their sudden, unexplained absence sent a shiver of fear to the people who had known them. There were whispers of foul play, of a kidnapping, of something far darker that might be at work. But there was no hard evidence to support any of it. The absence itself was the only clue, and it only deepened the mystery. Holden spent hours at the farmhouse, inspecting every inch of the property. There was nothing unusual about the structure. No broken windows, no traces of forced entry, no footprints leading away from the house. The doors had been unlocked, but that didn't necessarily mean someone had been inside. The family dog, Jasper, lay quietly in the living room, staring at him with unblinking eyes, a silent reminder of the home's emptiness. Holden had known that dog for years. He was a loyal companion, always at the heels of the walkers. But now he sat lifeless, as though he too had resigned to the mystery that had taken over his once peaceful home. The first few hours after the discovery were spent in a kind of stunned confusion. It was as though the whole town had come to a standstill. People stood on street corners, exchanging theories and speculating about what could have happened, but none of them had answers. There was no indication that the family had planned to leave. Emma had been preparing for Sarah's birthday party. Daniel had been getting ready to harvest the crops, and Noah had been playing with his favorite toy trucks just days before. It was as though the walkers had simply vanished in the middle of their everyday lives, slipping away into the unknown. Sheriff Holden's mind raced through all the possible scenarios, but none of them seemed to add up. It wasn't like the walkers to just leave without telling anyone. They were a tight-knit family, grounded in their routines, never one to draw attention to themselves. So why would they disappear? Why hadn't they taken their car or packed any belongings? Why was the house left in perfect order, with nothing more than the faint smell of last night's meal lingering in the air? The search parties combed the surrounding land, but there were no clues to be found. No signs that the walkers had ventured into the woods. No broken branches or disturbed soil. No traces of their scent. It was as though they had simply vanished, leaving nothing behind. Holden couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease as the hours passed. The longer the search continued without a breakthrough, the more unsettling the situation became. The town was left in limbo, teetering between confusion and fear. The walkers had been the very picture of normalcy. Why would they leave, and how could they have done so without a single trace? By the next day, the news of their disappearance had spread beyond the local community. The small town was suddenly thrust into the spotlight, with media outlets arriving from neighboring cities to cover the story. News trucks lined the streets, and reporters gathered in groups, speculating about the family's sudden vanishing. But despite the attention, no new information came to light. The sheriff's office, with its limited resources, struggled to keep up with the influx of questions and leads from concerned citizens. There were no suspects, no motives, and no clear direction for the investigation. The most frustrating part of the case was the complete lack of evidence. In cases like this, there were usually some clues to follow. Someone who had seen something, a strange vehicle in the area, a missing item that could provide a lead. But in this case, there was nothing. No sign of a struggle, no broken locks, no stolen items. It was as if the family had simply stepped out of their lives and into nothingness, leaving the world behind without a trace. Sheriff Holden, though accustomed to handling difficult cases, was starting to feel the weight of this one. The town was counting on him to find answers, but he felt helpless. There was no sign of any criminal activity, and yet everything about the walkers' disappearance suggested something sinister. The unease was growing. The town, once peaceful and quiet, was now filled with a sense of dread. People locked their doors a little tighter at night, spoke in hushed voices about the disappearance, and cast wary glances toward the nearby woods. As the days passed without any new information, the local authorities called in the state police to assist with the investigation. But still no leads emerged. The sheriff's department was stretched thin, and soon the FBI was contacted to take a closer look at the case. Though their involvement was a sign that the case was becoming more serious, it also added to the growing sense of unease. When the FBI arrived, their agents began to sift through the few pieces of evidence available, primarily the Walker family's last known activities and their social interactions in the weeks leading up to their disappearance. The disappearance of the Walker family sent ripples of shock and confusion through the small, tight-knit community, and the days that followed were filled with whispers, hushed conversations, and a palpable sense of unease. The people who had known the Walkers felt as though the ground beneath their feet had shifted, and they struggled to make sense of what had happened. The Walkers had been an ordinary family, nothing exceptional about them. At least, that's how it appeared to those who had known them for years. They lived in a quiet corner of the world, untouched by the chaos that often plagued larger towns. They were the kind of people one could set their watch by, dependable, kind, and familiar. They had no known enemies, no obvious conflicts. Yet, in the blink of an eye, they were gone, leaving nothing behind but an unsettling emptiness that stretched across the town. The initial shock had given way to disbelief, and then, as the days passed, the search for answers turned into a desperate hunt for meaning. In the heart of the town, at the local diner where the townsfolk gathered to catch up on the day's events, the Walkers' disappearance was the only topic of conversation. People leaned across tables, their voices low, sharing theories, speculating on what might have happened, as though talking about it could somehow bring the family back. They spoke of possible kidnappings, of abductions, of a dark fate that had befallen the Walkers. But all these ideas were just that, ideas, nothing more. The truth seemed to slip further and further away with each passing day. In the weeks that followed, the town began to fracture in ways that would have seemed unimaginable before. The quiet, communal existence they had once enjoyed now felt fragile, uncertain. Friends of the Walkers, people who had once shared cups of coffee or helped each other with farm chores, now found themselves divided. Some held on to the hope that the family had simply chosen to leave, to start over somewhere far away. Maybe they had been hiding something, financial troubles, personal issues, that they had never shared. But there was no evidence to support this theory. The Walkers had always appeared content, living a simple, modest life, and there was no indication that they had been anything but happy. So why would they leave? And why would they leave without a word? Others in the town couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister had taken place, a feeling that was only amplified by the fact that there were no clues, no signs of what had actually happened. It was as though the Walkers had simply ceased to exist. The lack of evidence felt like a weight, pressing down on everyone who had known them, making it harder to breathe, harder to move forward. People became obsessed with the idea that something terrible had occurred, even if they couldn't prove it. As the mystery deepened, so did the fear. The town's comforting sense of safety and security began to unravel, piece by piece, until there was little left but suspicion and uncertainty. The emotional toll on the people who had known the Walkers was impossible to ignore. Emma Walker had been a pillar of the community. She was the type of woman who always had time for others, always ready to lend a helping hand. If you were sick, she would bring over a homemade casserole. If you needed a ride to the store, she would drive you. Daniel, too, was well-liked. He wasn't the kind of man who sought attention, but he was known for his steady work ethic and his quiet, reliable presence. Together, they made a perfect pair, a family that seemed to fit perfectly into the rhythm of the small town. They were an embodiment of the kind of life everyone dreamed of, simple, grounded, and full of love. Emma and Daniel's children, Sarah and Noah, were lively, bright-eyed kids who loved to run to the fields surrounding their home, their laughter filling the air like music. They were the heart of the town, the innocence and purity that everyone cherished. And then, without warning, they were gone. The local church, where the Walkers had regularly attended services, was filled with grief-stricken parishioners. The pastor, Reverend Markham, struggled to find the words to console the congregation. People sat in silence, their minds racing as they tried to process the incomprehensible loss. How could it be that a family so rooted in the fabric of the community could simply vanish? The absence of answers was like an open wound, raw and painful, and it left everyone searching for something, anything, that could explain it. Some prayed for a safe return. Others prayed for strength to cope with the uncertainty. But no one had any real answers, and that made the grief even harder to bear. The town had been robbed of something precious, something irreplaceable, and in its place, there was nothing but a haunting, unanswered question. As the weeks turned into months, the search for the family's whereabouts slowed, though it never fully stopped. Sheriff Holden and his deputies continued their efforts, combing through the woods and surrounding areas, following up on any lead, no matter how small. They interviewed anyone who might have had contact with the Walkers in the weeks leading up to their disappearance. Neighbors, distant relatives, even strangers who had passed through the area. Everyone was questioned, but as the investigation dragged on, the number of solid leads dwindled. There was no indication of foul play, no trace of the family's movements after the morning they vanished. It was as if they had slipped through the cracks of the world, leaving no trace of their existence behind. The media coverage of the case had intensified, and with it, the pressure on the sheriff's department to find answers. Journalists descended on the town, their cameras trained on the courthouse, the sheriff's office, and the farmhouse that had once been a home but now stood as a grim symbol of the town's loss. Reporters interviewed townspeople, eager for any scrap of information they could use to fill the gaps in the story. But what they didn't understand, what no one seemed to understand, was that there was nothing to tell. No one had seen anything. No one knew anything. It was a mystery without a solution. And the more the press focused on the case, the more it seemed to twist into a narrative that didn't match the reality of the situation. The people of the town were left to bear the weight of the media's intrusion, but they could do little to change the story that was being told. In the midst of this growing confusion, the community began to splinter. Some people, who had once been close friends of the Walkers, began to pull away from the investigation. They couldn't bear the emotional strain of thinking about what might have happened, or worse, of thinking that perhaps the Walkers had simply abandoned them. Others, however, became more fixated on the idea that foul play was involved. Rumors began to circulate about a possible suspect, a man who had been seen lurking around the farmhouse on the day of the disappearance. Some speculated that he had been involved in the disappearance, but no evidence had confirmed these suspicions. As the days turned into weeks, and then weeks into months, the search for the Walker family continued. But the investigation began to unravel in frustrating, often disheartening ways. Sheriff Holden and his team found themselves repeatedly returning to the same dead ends, each lead falling apart just as quickly as it had appeared. With each passing day, the pressure mounted on Holden, on the town, on the very fabric of the investigation itself. The small community, once serene and secure, had transformed into a place of fear, of whispers, and of speculation. The mystery of the Walkers' disappearance was no longer just a question of where they had gone. It had become a question of how far-reaching the darkness behind it could truly be. Despite the apparent lack of leads, there were moments of hope, false hope, as it turned out, that kept the investigation moving forward, or at least kept it from falling into complete stagnation. Rumors, sightings, and tips from locals began to pour in, one after another. Each time, Sheriff Holden would hold on to the hope that this time, something would break. This time, there would be a breakthrough. But as the weeks turned into months, each tip seemed to lead them only further into the unknown, into realms of confusion that grew darker with each turn. One of the first false leads that arrived was a claim that a truck had been seen near the Walker farmhouse on the night of their disappearance. A witness, a local farmer who lived several miles away, reported seeing a dark-colored pickup truck parked on the edge of the Walkers' property around midnight on the night the family vanished. He couldn't remember much about the driver, other than that he had been wearing a baseball cap. The truck was gone by morning, but the witness didn't think to report immediately, dismissing it as an ordinary sighting at the time. When he finally came forward, the sheriff's office sprang into action. The truck was traced to a nearby mechanic, and soon they discovered it belonged to a man named Thomas Cleary, a local resident with a troubled past. Cleary had a reputation for being a bit of a loner, and he had been in trouble with the law before, mostly for small infractions, petty theft, and disturbances. It seemed like a promising lead, one that could potentially unlock the mystery. Sheriff Holden's team quickly moved to bring Cleary in for questioning. They searched his property, questioned his neighbors, and dug into his history, hoping to find something, anything, that would connect him to the Walkers. But Cleary denied any involvement. He claimed to have been miles away that night, working on his truck in his garage, a fact that his neighbors corroborated. No fingerprints were found on the Walker property, and nothing at Cleary's home seemed to connect him to the disappearance. His alibi, though vague, appeared to hold up. As quickly as it had arrived, the lead crumbled to dust, leaving the investigators back where they had started. Holden had to confront the bitter reality that Cleary, though a possible suspect, was no closer to being the perpetrator than any of the other residents of the town. Then there was the theory that the Walkers had simply decided to disappear on their own, a theory that some of the locals had latched onto. It was a thought that seemed impossible at first, given the family's nature. Daniel and Emma had been so committed to their farm, to their community. But as the days wore on, there was a growing number of voices in the town, who began to entertain the possibility that the Walkers had staged their disappearance. Perhaps they had been running from something, some sort of financial trouble, or perhaps an affair, or some secret they had been hiding. It wasn't an easy theory to swallow, but it was one that many began to consider when no other explanations emerged. The idea of the Walkers fleeing their life was difficult for Sheriff Holden to accept, especially since it seemed so out of character. Emma had been planning Sarah's birthday party just days before she vanished. Daniel had been working the fields, preparing for the harvest. They had no reason to leave, no indication that they were unhappy. Yet the more the townspeople speculated, the more questions arose. Was there something in their past they had been running from? The thought lingered in the air, and while Holden dismissed it initially, it was hard to ignore the mounting pressure to follow this line of thinking. In the absence of clear leads, the FBI was brought in. The agency's involvement added a sense of weight to the case, making it clear to everyone involved that the disappearance of the Walker family was being taken seriously, and that the town was no longer capable of handling the investigation on its own. The FBI agents quickly took a more methodical approach, sifting through every piece of evidence with a fine-toothed comb, examining phone records, financial histories, and any possible connection to outside criminal activity. They were thorough, precise, and unrelenting, but again they found nothing. The search for any sort of ransom demand was a futile endeavor. No calls had been made, no letters sent, no requests for money or negotiations. The FBI even reached out to international law enforcement, considering the possibility that the Walkers had been victims of an organized crime syndicate or human trafficking ring. But all avenues led nowhere. They looked into potential connections to the drug trade, to illicit dealings that might have found their way into the quiet rural life of the Walkers, but the search produced nothing concrete. As more and more false leads came and went, the frustration among law enforcement deepened. The lack of any clear suspects or evidence began to breed a sense of helplessness among the investigators, which only made the town's atmosphere more tense. By the time the summer the following year rolled around, the sense of urgency that had initially propelled the investigation forward had begun to wane. The media had moved on to other stories. The town's attention had shifted elsewhere, and the case seemed to be growing cold. There were no new theories, no fresh perspectives. The days stretched on, each one blending seamlessly into the next, as the mystery of the Walker family's disappearance continued to haunt the small town. Every lead, no matter how promising, had turned into a false hope, a cruel reminder that the answers they so desperately sought remained frustratingly out of reach. Sheriff Holden had seen his fair share of difficult cases, but nothing like this. The case was eating away at him, gnawing at his insides as he tried to piece together the puzzle of the Walker's sudden and inexplicable vanishing. The entire town had become consumed by it. Conversations in the local diner, once light and filled with idle chatter, now centered around nothing but the Walkers. Every neighbor, every family friend, every stranger who passed through town had a theory, but none of them were helpful. The silence in the town had grown oppressive, as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to break, the breakthrough they needed to solve this haunting puzzle. And then, almost by accident, it happened. It was a breakthrough that seemed so small at first, so insignificant, that no one could have predicted how significant it would eventually become. It came in the form of a phone call, a call that landed on Sheriff Holden's desk late one afternoon, after a long day of fruitless interviews and endless phone calls. The call came from an FBI agent named Erin Langston, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for persistence. She had been following the case from afar, monitoring the progress, or lack thereof, from a distance, and she had noticed something peculiar in the records. The tip had come in as nothing more than a minor discrepancy in the Walker family's phone records, but Langston had followed the trail, and she had found something that piqued her interest. The phone records, once thought to be a dead end, revealed something unexpected. Several days before the Walkers' disappearance, a burner phone, traced back to an anonymous number, had made several calls to the Walker household. The calls were brief, one lasting no more than a minute, the other lasting a little longer, but what stood out was the timing. These calls had been placed in the late hours of the night, at odd hours, when the Walkers were most likely asleep. The timing alone seemed suspicious, but it was the content of calls, or rather, the absence of it, that set off alarm bells for Langston. There were no recorded messages, no voices on the other end of the line, just the sound of silence. Whoever had placed the calls had never said a word. The mystery of these ghost calls, as they had come to be known, suddenly became the key to unraveling the whole case. Langston shared her findings with Sheriff Holden, and though he was initially skeptical, he couldn't deny the significance of the discovery. No one had thought to look into the phone records in this way. It was a small piece of the puzzle, but it was enough to spark a new wave of investigation. The calls were traced back to a burner phone purchased in a nearby town. But as with many burner phones, there were no records of ownership. The anonymity of it made it all the more troubling. There was no way to know who had made the calls, or why they had called the Walker family. But there was a disturbing pattern emerging, and Holden and Langston knew they had to follow it, no matter how far down the rabbit hole it led. The new direction in the investigation sent a ripple of energy through the team. For the first time in months, there was a sense of momentum. They had a lead, however faint, and they were determined to chase it down. Langston took the lead, reaching out to the phone provider to see if there were any records that could point them to the individual behind the burner phone. The investigation began to widen, but as they dug deeper, they began to uncover disturbing connections, ones that no one had anticipated. The first breakthrough came when they discovered that the burner phone's owner, though untraceable in the usual sense, had a link to a much darker world. A small file, hidden deep within a network of records, revealed that the burner phone had been used in connection with a series of underground, illegal activities, a network that had connections to people who operated far from the quiet life of rural Pennsylvania. The name that kept popping up in connection with the burner phone was Earl Dutton, a reclusive figure known in the area for his violent past and his history of criminal activity. Dutton had been a former soldier, someone with military training, but he had become a shadow of his former self. Living in the woods on the outskirts of town, a man whose presence was unsettling and whose reputation was stained with rumors of violence. His name had come up before in passing, during the early stages of the investigation, but had been dismissed as inconclusive. Now, though, the connection seemed undeniable. Langston and Holden quickly turned their attention to Dutton. They interviewed his neighbors, none of whom had seen anything suspicious around the time of the Walkers' disappearance, but there was an unsettling sense of foreboding when they spoke about him. People in town knew better than to approach Dutton. He was a man who preferred his solitude, who kept himself and stayed out of the public eye. But as the investigation dug deeper, they learned that Dutton had had a bitter, long-standing dispute with Daniel Walker. The two men had been neighbors for years, but their relationship had deteriorated over time. Rumors of arguments, of land disputes, and of old grudges surfaced, though none of it was ever confirmed. What was known was that Dutton had a temper, and he wasn't one to let things go easily. It was clear that if there was a connection between Dutton and the Walkers, it was a volatile one, but whether that connection had anything to do with their disappearance remained unclear. The investigation took a darker turn when they learned that Dutton had been seen near the Walker farmhouse just days before the family vanished. A few of the neighbors had seen him walking along the road that ran by their property, and one of them even reported seeing him lingering near the edge of their land at night. As the investigation into the Walker family's disappearance deepened, the town found itself at a crossroads. What had once seemed like a simple, if haunting, mystery had morphed into something far darker, more complex, and more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. With each new revelation, the ground beneath the town seemed to shift further, until even the most hardened of the investigators began to question everything they thought they knew. Sheriff Holden, who had prided himself on his methodical approach, found himself grappling with questions that no lawman should have to face. How had a quiet, rural family become entangled in such a sinister web? And what had really happened to them? The discovery of Earl Dutton's involvement had sent shockwaves through the investigation, opening doors that the sheriff and his team had never considered. As Holden and FBI agent Langston pieced together Dutton's past, they unearthed a trail of criminal activity that seemed to lead back decades. Dutton's life after his military discharge had been shrouded in secrecy. He had withdrawn from society, choosing instead to live in a dilapidated cabin on the edge of town. He had kept himself, rarely interacting with anyone except the occasional neighbor or the odd passerby. But beneath the surface of this reclusive lifestyle, there were signs of a man haunted by his past, a man who had built his life on a foundation of lies, deceit, and violence. The most disturbing part of Dutton's history was his connection to a group that, until now, had only been whispered about in the darkest corners of the town. The group, known only to a select few as the Order, was a shadowy network of individuals involved in illegal activities ranging from arms trafficking to money laundering to even more sinister operations that were too secretive and elusive to trace. For years, this underground group had operated in the shadows, its members hidden behind layers of false identities and encrypted communication. They were known for their ruthlessness, their ability to make people disappear without a trace. And now, it seemed they had left their mark on the Walker family. Earl Dutton, it turned out, had been a part of the Order long before he had come to live on the outskirts of town. His military service had been the perfect cover for his involvement in their operations, and his skills as a soldier made him an invaluable asset to their cause. But what had drawn him to the Walker family? Why had they become entangled in this dark network? It was a question that the sheriff could not answer, at least not yet. But the more they uncovered about Dutton's connection to the Order, the more it seemed that the Walker family had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Agent Langston began to dig into the communications and financial records of the Order, hoping to uncover some link between the group and the Walkers. The more she uncovered, the more it became clear that there had been some form of contact between them. Though the details were murky, the Walkers, as it turned out, had unknowingly become pawns in a larger, more dangerous game. Their farm, with its isolated location and its modest income, had been the perfect cover for the group's activities. The Walkers had unwittingly been involved in smuggling operations, though they had no knowledge of it. Small shipments, disguised as mundane farming supplies, had passed through their property, shipments that had gone unnoticed by everyone except those involved in the operations. The Walkers had thought nothing of it. They were simply trying to make a living, raising their children, and living their simple life. But all that changed when Daniel Walker had stumbled upon something he shouldn't have. One fateful night, after a long day of work on the farm, Daniel had gone to check the barn, a routine task he did every evening. What he didn't know was that on that particular night, the smuggling operation he had unwittingly been a part had taken a darker turn. It was unclear whether Daniel had discovered something he wasn't supposed to see, or whether someone from the Order had decided it was time to eliminate any potential threat. What was certain, however, was that Daniel's discovery had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the Walker family's disappearance. The question of what exactly Daniel had discovered remained unanswered, but Langston and Holden began to theorize. It was possible that Daniel had accidentally uncovered a shipment of illegal weapons or narcotics, something that the Order had been moving to the town under the radar. Whatever it was clear that Daniel had seen enough to put himself and his family at risk. And in the world of the Order, when someone became a liability, there was only one way to deal with it: silence. But the silence, it seemed, was not enough. The Order had made sure that not only Daniel, but his entire family was erased from the world they had once known. The investigation uncovered disturbing details about the lengths the group would go to in order to maintain their secrecy. As the investigation into the disappearance of the Walker family took a darker turn, the weight of the truth began to press down heavily on the small town. What had started as a search for a missing family had spiraled into something far more sinister: an unraveling conspiracy involving shadowy networks of crime and deception. For Sheriff Holden, the pressure was mounting. The small, peaceful community that had once been a place where everyone knew each other's names was now entangled in a web of violence and secrecy that threatened to destroy everything it had once been. And as he and Agent Langston dug deeper into the Order, the realization began to set in. The Walker family was only the latest casualties in a much larger, more dangerous game. The breakthrough came when they discovered a crucial link between the Order and a local, long-standing business. It was a farm supply company, innocuous on the surface, but one that had quietly become a hub for illegal activity over the years. The company, which had once provided everything from seeds to equipment to the farmers in the surrounding area, had quietly shifted its focus in recent years. What had once been a legitimate business had now become a front for a network that was far more than anyone in the town could have imagined. The owners, the Spence family, had long been considered upstanding members of the community, respected for their contributions to the local economy. They had even helped the Walkers over the years with supplies, offering discounts and favors when needed. But now, as Langston and Holden combed through records and interviewed people who had worked there, the truth began to emerge. The Spences were not what they seemed. It became clear that the Spence family had been deeply involved in the Order's operations. Their business, though not large in scale, had been an essential piece of the network, a way for them to launder money and move illicit goods without drawing attention. The Spences had ties to powerful figures within the organization, and their farm supply company had served as a convenient way to mask the real operations taking place behind closed doors. At first, it seemed impossible that a respected family like the Spences could have been involved in something so nefarious, but as Holden and Langston dug deeper, it became more and more evident that the family had been complicit in a larger criminal enterprise for years. They had aided in smuggling operations, had moved weapons, drugs, and even people, all while keeping up the appearance of legitimate business. The connection to the Walkers was made clearer with each passing day. Daniel Walker had unknowingly been part of the network, his farm and the supplies he used having been part of the smuggling routes that the Spences helped facilitate. It was a disturbing realization, but it didn't explain why Daniel, his wife Emma, and their children had been singled out for disappearance. The Walkers had been innocent bystanders in all of this, not knowing they had been drawn into a much larger operation. Their only mistake, it seemed, was that Daniel had stumbled too close to something dangerous, something that had been hidden right under his nose. The more Holden and Langston uncovered about the Spences, the more they realized that the Walker family's disappearance was not an isolated event. There were other families in the area who had also disappeared over the years, their cases quietly closed with no answers, no resolution. Some of them had been more directly involved in the network than others, but all of them shared one common denominator. They had either known too much or had been caught in the web of criminal activity that the Spences and the Order had woven around the town. These disappearances were not random, they were deliberate, and they were part of a pattern that went back decades. As they pieced together the timeline, Langston and Holden discovered that the Spences' ties to the Order went even deeper than they had originally thought. The company's location, tucked away on the outskirts of town, was a perfect place to conceal the illegal operations that were taking place. The remote location allowed the Spences to operate in relative secrecy, conducting transactions in the dead of night, moving shipments of illegal goods under the guise of routine deliveries. The Walker family, by virtue of their farm's location and their ties to the supply company, had unknowingly become part of this operation. But there was one thing that stood out. Daniel Walker had begun to ask questions. The moment Daniel had started asking about the shipments, about the strange deliveries and the discrepancies in the supply orders, he had crossed a line. For the first time, he had begun to see the cracks in the world he had always believed in. Whether it was out of curiosity, suspicion, or something deeper, Daniel had begun to dig, and that had made him a liability. The Order could not afford for anyone to start asking questions, especially someone as connected to the community as Daniel. The disappearance of the Walkers was not just about eliminating a threat. It was a message. They had to make an example of the family, to ensure that no one else would dare question what was really going on. The Spences, it seemed, had played a key role in covering up the family's disappearance. The more Holden and Langston learned, the more they began to understand the depths of the Spences' involvement in the Order's network. But their role in the Walkers' fate was not clear yet. Had they been willing participants, or had they been coerced into helping cover up the crime? The Spences were well-respected members of the community, and it was hard to imagine how they could have been part of something so evil. But as Holden and Langston pushed further, it became clear that the Spences had been hiding their true nature all along. Behind the facade of respectability, they were a part of a much darker world. The next step in the investigation was to find out just how far the Order's reach extended. With the Spences now under suspicion, Holden and Langston knew they had to act quickly. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. As the investigation into the Walker family's disappearance evolved, the landscape of the case became unrecognizable. The quiet town, once untouched by crime or controversy, had become the backdrop for a dark, sprawling conspiracy that stretched far beyond its borders. Sheriff Holden, once a trusted figure in the community, now felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on him from all sides. The more he uncovered, the more he realized how deeply the town had been intertwined with the sinister world of the Order. What had once been a search for a missing family had now become a desperate race against time, one in which the very essence of the community was at stake. The deeper they dug, the more they learned about the terrifying forces at play. And with each new revelation, it became increasingly clear that they were up against something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. The realization that the Spence family had been complicit in the crimes of the Order opened up an entirely new dimension of the investigation. It was one thing to uncover the Walker family's unintentional involvement in the network, but it was another to learn that people in the town, people who had been trusted members of the community, had been working behind the scenes to protect and profit from the underground operations. The Spences, who had been running a farm supply business for decades, had carefully cultivated an image of respectability. They had been pillars of the local economy, helping farmers and families with their needs, quietly building a legacy that spanned generations. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, the Spences had been orchestrating a far more insidious operation, using their business as a front for illegal smuggling, money laundering, and human trafficking. The Walker family, in their innocence, had become entangled in this world without ever knowing it. But once Daniel had started asking the wrong questions, it became clear that he and his family were marked for silence. As Holden and Langston continued to explore the Spences' involvement in the operations of the Order, they began to uncover a chilling pattern, one that suggested the Spences were far more than just passive participants. They were central figures in the network. Their business had been a crucial part of the operation, providing cover for shipments of illegal goods, facilitating the movement of people across borders, and laundering money from criminal activities. In their desperation to keep the operation running smoothly, they had been willing to go to any lengths to protect it. They had ruthlessly silenced anyone who threatened to expose the truth, and the Walkers had been no exception. The details of the Walker family's disappearance grew more disturbing with each passing day. It became increasingly clear that Daniel's discovery had not been an accident. It had been the catalyst for a chain of events that led to his family's abduction. The Spences had been aware of the Walker family's growing suspicion, and they had taken measures to ensure that no one would learn the truth. The fact that the Walker family had disappeared without a trace was a testament to the lengths the Spences and the Order had gone to cover up their crimes. But as the investigation wore on, Holden and Langston realized that the true horror lay not just in the family's disappearance, but in the dark, twisted network that had ensnared them. As the scope of conspiracy continued to expand, Holden found himself facing a new kind of fear. Fear of what would happen if they didn't act fast. The Walkers' disappearance was just the tip of the iceberg. The Spences were not the only people involved in this operation. They were part of a much larger network, one that spanned across state lines and reached into powerful, unseen corners of society. The more Holden learned, the more he realized how deeply entrenched the Order was, and how far their influence stretched. This was not a small-time operation. It was a massive, shadowy network of criminals, and it was operating right under their noses. Langston and Holden worked tirelessly to unravel the web of deceit, but they were met with constant obstacles. Every lead they followed seemed to be either a dead end or a trap. They had uncovered enough to know that the Spences were deeply connected to the Order, but they needed more. They needed hard evidence, something that would allow them to take down the entire network. But as they dug deeper, they found themselves up against powerful adversaries, people with the means and the motivation to make sure that the truth never saw the light of day. In their quest for answers, Langston and Holden began to feel the pressure mounting. They had come too far to turn back, but they were starting to realize that they were walking a fine line between justice and danger. The more they uncovered, the more it became apparent that the Order would stop at nothing to protect their interests. They had already silenced the Walkers. What was stopping them from silencing anyone else who got too close to the truth? Holden's once quiet town was now a battleground, one where the stakes were far higher than he had ever imagined. The breakthrough had come at a heavy price. Holden and Langston knew they had to act swiftly, but with every step forward, the danger grew more acute. The file, with its chilling details and names that marked innocent lives stolen by the Order, was a ticking time bomb. They had what they needed to expose a network, but the problem was much bigger than either of them had initially imagined. The web of corruption stretched far beyond the town's borders, reaching into the darkest corners of society, where even the most powerful figures could be bought and sold. The stakes were no longer just about solving a family's disappearance. It was about dismantling an entire criminal syndicate that had been operating for years, unseen and untouchable. And as Holden stared at the list of names of people who had vanished under mysterious circumstances, names that could no longer be ignored, he realized that the fight ahead would be unlike anything he had ever faced. The Spences, the linchpin of this criminal network, had been instrumental in its operations, and now, with the evidence of their ties to the Order laid bare, Holden and Langston had no choice but to move quickly. They knew that the longer they waited, the more likely it was that the Spences would make their escape, or worse, erase any remaining traces of their involvement. The Spences were a dangerous family, with a history of violence and deceit. They had built their empire over decades, quietly weaving themselves into the fabric of the town's economy and society. Their ability to operate under the radar had made them untouchable for so long, and now that their world was beginning to unravel, they would do everything in their power to protect themselves and to silence anyone who got too close to the truth. But as Holden prepared to take the next steps in the investigation, he knew that the Spences were just the tip of the iceberg. The file Langston had decrypted contained much more than just evidence of their involvement. It also revealed a network of powerful individuals who had aided and abetted the Order's operations. There were politicians, law enforcement officers, business leaders, people who had used their positions to shield the Order from scrutiny to ensure that it could operate unchecked. Some of the names in the file were shockingly familiar. People Holden had trusted. People who had once been allies in his mission to protect the town. And now, as the pieces fell into place, he was forced to confront a painful truth. Some of the people he had worked alongside for years were likely complicit in the crimes that had been committed. Langston had already begun reaching out to her contact within the FBI, coordinating with agents across state lines to begin bringing down the operation. The goal was to strike fast, to hit the Order where it hurt, and disarm them before they could retaliate. But even as she worked behind the scenes to pull in the necessary resources, Holden knew that this wasn't just a matter of law enforcement. This was a battle for the soul of his town. It was a fight for everything he had spent his life protecting. And with that weight on his shoulders, he began to realize just how personal this had become. The Walker family had been his responsibility, his charge. He had known them, had seen their children grow up, had helped them through difficult times, had shared meals with them on the front porch of their farmhouse. To think that such a quiet, unassuming family had been caught in the crossfire of a dark and deadly network left Holden with a sense of betrayal so deep it was almost unbearable. What did it mean for a town to lose its innocence, to discover that everything it had once believed in, everything it had taken for granted, was a lie? How could Holden look at the people he had sworn to protect and tell them that the rot had spread too deep, that the people they had trusted were just as capable of monstrous acts as those who had orchestrated the crimes from the shadows? The days that followed were a blur. Holden worked tirelessly, checking and rechecking the evidence, following every lead, tracking down every suspect. He and Langston met in the dead of night to strategize, their conversations a mix of urgency and quiet determination. Each step they took brought them closer to the heart of the operation, but each revelation also deepened the danger. The Order was far from a disorganized criminal gang. It was a sophisticated, ruthless syndicate that had entrenched itself in nearly every level of society. They had been careful, deliberate, and patient. Every move they made had been calculated to avoid detection, to slip beneath the radar of those who would try to expose them. As the investigation pushed forward, Holden and Langston began to receive anonymous threats. Letters slid under the door of the sheriff's office, warnings scrawled in block letters, each one more menacing than the last. It was clear now that the Order had grown aware of the investigation, and they would stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. Holden had always prided himself on his ability to handle pressure, but these threats weighed heavily on him. His every move was now being watched, and he could feel the walls closing in. There were moments, in the quiet hours of the night, when he wondered whether they were getting too close, whether they were putting everyone at risk by continuing to pursue the truth. But he pushed those doubts aside. The Walkers, the other victims, their stories had to be told. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. The tipping point came when Holden and Langston finally located the Spences. They had gone underground, disappearing from the face of the town as quickly as they had arrived. But they weren't hiding in some far-off country. They were still close, still within reach. Holden tracked them to an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, an industrial building that had once been used as a storage facility for farm equipment. But now, it seemed, the warehouse had a much darker purpose. It was a meeting place, a place where the last vestiges of the Order's influence remained. The Spences were there, along with several high-ranking members of the network, preparing to make their final escape. But Holden knew that they could not let them go, not now, not after everything they had learned. He and Langston staged a raid on the warehouse, bringing in every resource they had. The sound of helicopters above, the heavy footsteps of law enforcement agents closing in, created an atmosphere of tension and anticipation. Time seemed to slow as Holden approached the building, his hand on his gun, his mind racing through every possible outcome. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. This wasn't just another bust. This was personal. The Spences were at the heart of it all. And if they could be brought to justice, if the full extent of their crimes could be exposed, it might be enough to dismantle the Order and bring some sense of closure to the victims they had so callously destroyed. The operation was swift and intense. The Spences and their allies were caught off guard, but the resistance was fierce. It was clear that the Order would not go down without a fight. Gunfire echoed through the warehouse as agents moved in, clearing each room with precision. Holden felt his heart pounding in his chest as he entered the building, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. This wasn't just a raid. This was a reckoning. The people who had stolen the Walker family's lives, and so many others, were finally going to pay for their crimes. In the end, the raid was successful. The Spences were arrested, their ties to the Order exposed to the world to see. But even as they were led away in handcuffs, Holden knew that the battle was far from over. The Order was still out there. Their influence, though weakened, still held sway over powerful figures in politics, law enforcement, and business. The fight to bring them down was just beginning. And for Sheriff Holden, it would be a fight that would test every ounce of his resolve, every belief he had ever held about justice, and every bond of loyalty he had ever forged with the town he had sworn to protect. The Walker family's disappearance had set off a chain of events that had rocked the town to its core. But as the investigation drew to a close, Holden realized that the real work was only just beginning. The truth had been exposed, but the consequences of that truth would continue to reverberate through the town for years to come. The price of justice was steep, but Holden knew that he had made the right choice. He had fought for the Walkers. He had fought for the truth. And no matter what came next, he would never stop fighting for his town. The events that had transpired over the past months felt like a whirlwind, leaving behind a sense of both closure and unrest. The arrest of the Spences, once pillars of the community, had been a moment of vindication, a brief flicker of justice in an otherwise dark and broken landscape. But as the dust began to settle, Holden and Langston knew that their work was far from over. The raid had been a decisive blow to the Order, but it was only one battle in a much larger war, one that was not only about bringing criminals to justice, but about rebuilding a shattered community. For Holden, the emotional toll was heavy, and he found himself grappling with the enormity of what had happened, not just to the Walker family, but to the town he had spent his life protecting. The arrest of the Spences had sent ripples through the town, each one more destructive than the last. Once the news broke, the town was thrown into turmoil. People struggled to reconcile the truth with the image they had long held of the Spences, respected farmers, hard-working business owners, friends, and neighbors. To learn that they had been deeply involved in the Order, using their business as a front for illegal activities, was almost too much to bear. The community had built itself on trust, on relationships that spanned generations, and now that trust had been irrevocably broken. Many people were left questioning how deep the corruption really ran. If the Spences, people they had known their whole lives, had been involved, who else could be hiding in plain sight? The fear of betrayal hung over the town like a thick fog, and emotional damage of discovering the extent of the Order's operations was impossible to ignore. In the midst of all this, Holden found himself standing at the center of it all. He had spent so many years in law enforcement, so many years trying to uphold a sense of peace and order in his town, that he never anticipated he would one day be faced with a situation like this. He never imagined that the very fabric of the town would unravel beneath his feet. There were moments when he felt lost, unsure of who he could trust, unsure where to turn. The Walker family's disappearance had set everything into motion, but it also shown him how fragile everything he had worked for really was. Langston, too, felt the weight of the investigation bearing down on her. She had joined the FBI with a singular mission: to fight injustice, to bring criminals to justice, and to protect the innocent. But what she had uncovered in this small town had tested everything she believed in. The lines between right and wrong had blurred. The faces of people who had been part of the system she believed in now appeared less like allies and more like puppets for a sinister and pervasive force. She had seen corruption before, but nothing like this. The order had its hooks deep within the town, and she knew that the arrest of the Spences was only the beginning of a much larger effort to root out the network. But despite the overwhelming darkness that had engulfed the town, there were moments of light, small victories that gave Holden and Langston the strength to keep going. The Walker family's disappearance had taken on a new sense of urgency now. With the Spences in custody, they had gained access to more information, records, connections, and even communications that linked members of the order to high-ranking officials in various parts of the country. It became clear that the order was not just a small-time operation. It was a sprawling criminal syndicate, deeply entrenched in the fabric of society, with the ability to move people, goods, and money across borders with ease. The Walker family had been just one of many victims of this vast machine, and Holden and Langston were determined to ensure that their story did not get lost in the shadow of everything else. But as they dug deeper into the tangled mess of the Order's operations, they realized how little they truly knew. Even with the Spences in custody, there were still so many questions that remained unanswered. What had happened to Walkers? Had they been sold into human trafficking, like so many others? Were they still alive? Or had they been killed, disposed of by the very people who had orchestrated their disappearance? And what about the other families? How many people had been taken, their fates sealed by the actions of this insidious group? The answers were just out of reach, and Holden found himself consumed with the need to know the truth. In the weeks that followed the raid, the investigation took on a new, more personal urgency. Holden began to revisit old files, speaking to neighbors and people who had known the Walkers for years, try to piece together the final fragments of their story. Every lead seemed to go cold. Every step forward was met with another obstacle. It was as though the Order had covered their tracks so well that they had left no trace, no evidence that could lead back to them. And yet, Holden and Langston pressed on, refusing to let the truth slip through their fingers. The toll it took on Holden was evident. He spent long hours in his office, going through stacks of papers, sometimes unable to sleep, staring at the case file as if the answer might jump out at him if he just looked hard enough. The strain began to show on his face, dark circles under his eyes, a perpetual weariness in his movements. He had been a steady presence in the town for so many years, but now, with the world around him unraveling, he wondered if he had lost something essential in the process. Could a man who had spent his life serving the law still trust himself when faced with betrayal of this magnitude? Could he still hold on his faith in justice, in the system he had sworn to uphold, when that very system seemed to have failed so many innocent people? Langston, too, felt the weight of the investigation pressing down on her. The FBI had poured so many resources into this case, and yet it seemed like the more they uncovered, the more they realized just how vast the Order's influence really was. They were chasing shadows, pulling at threads that seemed to disappear into nothing. The realization that the Order had ties to so many powerful figures, people who had the means to protect the network and keep it hidden, was a sobering one. They were up against more than just a criminal syndicate. They were up against a system that was designed to protect the guilty and punish the innocent. Langston began to feel the strain of the case in ways she hadn't expected. The work had always been personal for her, but now it was even more so. She couldn't shake the thought of the victims, the families who had been torn apart, the lives that had been shattered. She wanted to bring them justice, but she knew that justice in this case might not come as easily as she had hoped. It was during one of their late-night meetings that Langston came across something unexpected. An old lead, buried deep in the records they had gathered. A name appeared on a document, a name that was familiar from the list of powerful individuals associated with the Order. This name was not just any name. It was someone with direct ties to the Walker family, someone who had been a part of their lives long before they disappeared. The discovery was a bombshell, one that promised to change everything. Holden's heart raced as Langston explained what they had found. The connection was too close to ignore. It was someone from within the community who had been feeding information to the Order, someone who had been working with the Spences. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. This person had known the Walkers intimately, had known their routines, their patterns, their weaknesses. And yet, they had betrayed them, perhaps even orchestrated their disappearance for reasons that remained unclear. The name was a thread that they could not afford to ignore. This discovery was not just another lead. It was a key to unlocking the mystery of the Walker family's fate. But as Holden and Langston began to follow the trail, they found themselves once again in the crosshairs of the Order. The closer they got to the truth, the more desperate their adversaries became. It was clear now that their pursuit of justice had become a race against time, a battle not just for the Walker family, but for the future of the town itself. The Order would stop at nothing to protect their secrets, and Holden knew that the final confrontation would be unlike anything they had faced before. The stakes had never been higher, and the truth, while within reach, was still as elusive as ever. In the end, Holden found himself standing at the crossroads of his life, facing a choice that would define his legacy. The investigation had taken everything from him, his peace, his sense of security, even his faith in the community he had sworn to protect. But one thing was clear: he could never turn back. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. The Walker family deserved justice, and so did everyone else who had been swept up in the Order's insidious network. With his heart heavy but his resolve steeled, Holden knew that the final chapter of the story was yet to be written.